Welcome to Lesson 1-3. Here we're going to talk about absolute and relative change. So absolute change is going to be where you take the absolute value of your change. And we're going to call it an absolute increase or an absolute decrease. So we're going to do whatever our new amount is minus whatever the original amount was. And then we're going to take the absolute value of that. Remember, these bars are called absolute value bars, and what that means is that once you get what's inside down to a single number, you make that number positive. If it's positive, it stays positive. If it's negative, it becomes positive, because absolute value is the distance for how far that number is from 0, and we can't have a negative distance. Like, I can't go negative 2 feet. I would say I went 2 feet backwards. So that's why absolute change is going to be an absolute increase or an absolute decrease. Relative change is going to be a percentage. So how is this change relative to the grand scheme of things? So we're going to take the absolute change, however much we increase or decrease by, as a positive value. We're going to divide that by how much we started with, multiply by 100, and that will give us a percent of how much we changed by. A relative increase or relative decrease, and this is also known as percent of change, if you recall doing that before. The starting quantity in this case is called the base of the percent of change. So that's why it's on the bottom of the fraction. So, example here. The value of a car dropped from $7,400 to $6,800 over the past year. What percent decrease is this? When it says percent decrease, we're talking about relative. We have to find the absolute first, though, before we can do the relative. So I abbreviated absolute to ABS. We're going to do our new amount, which is $6,800, minus the original of $7,400. That comes out to negative $600. But you take the absolute value, it becomes a positive $600, and it was a $600 decrease. Now that we have the absolute change, we're going to do the relative by doing the absolute over our starting amount. So 600 over 7,400, which is 0.081. Multiply that by 100, it comes out to an 8.1% decrease. Or if you don't use the words increase and decrease, it could also have been done as a negative 8.1% change. But that looks kind of weird, so we normally just say a percent of decrease or increase. Next example. A politician's support increases from 45% of voters to 60%. Describe the change. When we use the phrase describe the change, that means the relative change. So, we went from 45 to 60. 60 minus 45 is a change of 15. We do 15 divided by our original amount of 45, which is 0.3 repeating. Multiply by 100, and it comes out to a 33.3 repeating percent. So what this means is the support increased, so it means support increased by about 33%. Last example here. Average pay for full-time employees in New York is about $60,300 per person. Average pay in South Dakota is $32,800 per person. Compare the average pay in two different ways. So we're going to use the relative change. So with this relative change, it makes a difference as far as which you use your base. Now, we typically put the base as whatever we started with. But in this case, we're just comparing two quantities. So by doing two different ways, we're going to use one state as the base, one example, and then in the other one, we're going to use the other state and see how that affects the percentages. So we're going to first use New York as the base. So what that means is New York is the original. So New York is the base because New York is the original and South Dakota is going to classify as the new. So we do the 32,800. 32,800 minus 60,300 is negative 27,500 take the absolute value of that, and it's 27,500. We now take that amount and divide it by our original, which is the base, New York, of 60,300. Comes out to 0.456, multiplied by 100, and it rounds to approximately 46%. So going from New York to South Dakota, it's a 46% decrease. So this means South Dakota's average pay is 46% less than New York. Now, we're going to flip it around and we're going to see then how does this compare with New York, or using South Dakota as the base. So this time we're going to use South Dakota as the base. So that means South Dakota is going to classify as the original. The absolute change does not change. We're still using the same two numbers, and it's still going to be that 27,500. That's still the difference between our two numbers. But this time we have South Dakota with the 32,800 as the base for our fraction instead. We divide those and we get 0.83841. You multiply that by our 100 and it comes out to approximately an 84% increase. So what that means is New York's average is 84% higher than South Dakota. So this goes to show you that depending on which number you use as your base, your data could look differently as far as percentages are concerned. Because we use the same data and the same numbers for these two, we just changed which one we used as our base, as our original amount. So, if this was some kind of sales pitch you were trying to make, if you're in favor of New York, then you would want to use South Dakota as your base, because saying we're 84% higher sounds a lot better than just saying South Dakota is 46% less. And again, it's just all relative compared to what are we using as a base here.